All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Really a pleasure to see you on this rainy evening. And I'm happy to welcome you to our 15th conversation in our series that we started last semester. I'm Dietrich Naumann. I'm the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. And as you know, this series is meant to bring together thinkers, writers, artists, musicians, with different publics in the city of Providence, and for exchanging ideas and having good conversations. And we also want to make this house as open to the public as possible. And I think all of our speakers have been local so far, and what they have shared with us speaks to the vibrancy of our amazing city that we all love so much. And next week we'll have Bert Krenker, who founded AS220 as a speaker, and we'll continue along those lines. And tonight we have with us Gonzalo Cuervo, who, as you all know, is running for mayor of Providence. And before I introduce him, I should say right at the beginning that, of course, we have invited everyone who is running for mayor of Providence to speak in this series. We had Brett Smiley here last semester, and we'll hopefully get to everyone. I should also say Brown is a nonprofit organization, and there are certain rules that we follow. It's very important to emphasize that this is not a campaign event. There will be no fundraising or asking for volunteers or votes. It's also not an endorsement from our end, but rather it's a chance to get to hear from Gonzalo as a citizen, fellow citizen and a fellow lover of our city of Providence, hear about his ideas and his approach to the future of our city. And I greatly look forward to that. He was born here in Providence, born and raised in our city. His parents had immigrated from Colombia. He went to Springfield College and Bryant University, and then in the 1990s became a community organizer on the south side. And when he was 21, he already had a graphic design business on Broad Street. Amazing. And then he started writing weekly columns for the Pawtucket Times and Providence and Espanol, and worked for a neighborhood health plan of Rhode Island. And then very important for us, he's one of the co-authors in 2002 of a white paper that led in the end to the creation of the city's Department of Art, Culture and Tourism under then Mayor Cicilline. We work very closely with that city department, and obviously he did a very good job because Cicilline then hired him as the Director of Communications, and then after that he became Director of Development and Outreach, and then that was followed by Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief of Staff to Mayor Angel Tavera. So a long list of political appointments, a lot of experience in this field, and after that he became Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea. And in this role, he worked to increase civic participation across the state, modernize Rhode Island's voting infrastructure, pass lobbying reform legislation, and of course ensure our last statewide election during a global pandemic. He's also a teacher at Mount Pleasant High School, serves on several boards, such as ALS, Association of Rhode Island, Crossroads Rhode Island, Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, Teatro ICAS, the Latino Policy Institute and Roger Williams Park Conservancy. And Gonzalo lives on Mount Pleasant Avenue with his wife Frances, who came along tonight. So thank you and welcome. And also along came his senior advisor, Angel Supervi, who is somewhere in the corner. Angel, thanks for joining us. And they have two adult children, if I may mention that. Also Daniel, who also lives in Providence and continues the tradition, and the daughter Stephanie, who is an engineering major at UConn. So really excited that you're here and look forward to hearing your vision for our city. But please all help me welcome Gonzalo Cuervo.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Dietrich, for that introduction. So this is a very special occasion for me, and the opportunity to be part of this conversation series for me is equally as exciting to present a little bit about myself and how I see our city developing in the future, and also to hear from you and to get impressions from you and what you believe are the areas where our city has room for improvement and for growth. So as Dietrich mentioned in the introduction, I've had a curious trajectory in my life. I've spent a lot of years in public administration, but I've also been very involved in community engagement and organizing at a very grassroots, granular level. I started when I was 19 years old, working with organizations like Direct Action for Rights and Equality and Quisqueya in Action, which was a Latino organization on the South Side in the 90s. And I was really drawn to civic engagement, primarily by the example of my parents. My parents came from Colombia in the mid to late 60s, when there were very few Latinos here. And it's very interesting because my parents have a trajectory that reflects a lot of the 20th century of the Rhode Island economy. My father was brought here when the textile industry was in decline, and there were some smaller textile operators that were being innovative in order to survive, as the larger textile operators went out of business or moved down south where conditions were more favorable. And some of these smaller operators decided that they were going to try bringing in highly qualified but less expensive labor from somewhere else. So my dad was a textile loom mechanic. He basically could take apart any of these large looms and repair them and stuff. And he and several of his friends were brought over from Colombia to work in the remaining textile industry in the Blackstone Valley. And he was 24 years old at the time. And eventually that textile industry was unable to survive. Even the more innovative, smaller, more agile companies were unable to survive, and they basically shut down towards the end of the 60s and definitely in the 70s. But my father was able to transition into the machine industry, which was a really big part of the Rhode Island economy also. And he became a tool maker. And he worked in that industry until the early 2000s, and his retirement kind of coincided with the age of automation. And I love to tell this story because he was a tool maker in an era where they used calipers, and they actually had slide rules, and they had to program these machines basically manually. Even though they were computerized machines, you had to write the code with the calculations for the cutting. And right around the time that he aged out of that industry, they were transitioning to automation. So now the machine industry is fully automated. And now, instead of it being good paying labor or blue collar jobs, now it's basically one person who is paid a fairly low wage to keep track of the machines in case any of them break down, and then they kind of repair. So my mom, who was a laborer, she retired from the jewelry industry right around the same time that industry was also in serious decline here. So it's very interesting how we've, over the last 2 decades, have really transitioned into more of a service economy. And I think that says a lot about where we are positioned as a city and as a state, because for years, for generations, maybe almost for centuries, Rhode Island was a beacon for blue-collar folks, laborers who would come here seeking good-paying jobs that didn't require a very high level of expertise or a very high level of education. And we've lost that. And what's happened is that we've been not very successful in replacing that as an economic engine. And therefore, we've had to deal with the fallout, which is higher levels of poverty, increased public spending in subsidies of social service programs, and really lower quality of life for a lot of our working families. And that's one thing where I think that we can have a serious impact in the city of Providence, because Providence is a really remarkable city. We have institutions like Brown University, we have many world-class institutions, we have incredibly talented people that are attracted by these institutions. We have an unbelievable arts and culture scene that generates hundreds of millions of dollars each year into the economy. But we also have a lot of people that are suffering the consequences of poverty, persistent poverty. And folks who are basically in a subsistence model, in a survival model. And the service economy that we have developed has left many of those folks behind. And what we've seen in recent years is that technology has brought about the gig economy, which has kind of filled the gap significantly. And it's not a real long-term solution. So what you have now in many neighborhoods in our city are folks who will have a part-time job somewhere, and then they leave that part-time job and they deliver in their personal car for Amazon Flex, or they deliver food for Grubhub, or they drive people around for Uber, or they do a combination of these things, and they end up working around the clock for very little money and no stability. And really, when you add up the costs involved in operating a vehicle and the wear and tear and all these costs that are involved, you know, the real impact on the bottom line is minimal. So that we really have to do something about that, because that model is not sustainable. Having so many families just getting by in our city is not sustainable for anybody. And the reason why it isn't sustainable is because it doesn't allow the city's tax base to grow, it doesn't allow the economy to grow, and it just creates a further burden on the existing systems that impacts everybody else. It impacts everybody. It impacts the taxes that people pay. It impacts the city's ability to deliver quality services. Everything from keeping the streets safe and clean to keeping our school buildings in decent quality. And you know, Dietrich mentioned that as part of my introduction, that I have worked as a substitute teacher at Mount Pleasant High School. I actually did that for a very short period of time. So when I left the Secretary of State's office, I was the Deputy Secretary of State, and I left that. And I left that to begin to formally campaign for the office of mayor last year. I wanted to experience what the school environment was like in the middle of a pandemic in the year 2021. Because those of us who are involved in public policy and administration, we talk a lot about education and we talk about the needs of our youth, but most of the folks that are talking about these things haven't been in a public school since they left when they were teenagers. And I figured, even if I was there for a very brief period of time, I think that having an opportunity to immerse myself in that environment as an observer, right? As an observer, as a substitute teacher, would provide some valuable insight. And I can say that it did indeed provide some valuable insight, because a school like Mount Pleasant, which is 2.5 blocks away from my home, has a very vibrant community, but is a fabulous representation of all the needs that exist in public education today. From a crumbling building infrastructure to the persistent poverty of its student population, to the dynamic between the teachers and the administration. It was a very, very fascinating environment. I was there for almost a month as a substitute teacher. And I can say that, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to do a lot of teaching because there weren't very many lessons plans left. So you basically had to improvise continuously and almost serve as an in-house tutor for students, because there wasn't a lot of continuity when teachers were absent. And sometimes teachers were absent for a week or multiple days, and it was a very fascinating experience. But getting back to the city of Providence, we have a city of 190,000 inhabitants, where almost a quarter of the population is under the age of 18. And that population is a very diverse population. You know, the Latino community in Providence has grown exponentially. We're approximately 45% of the population. Another 16% is African American, and approximately 6% is Asian. And it's a very young population. Only 10% of the population of the city of Providence is over the age of 65, which is a dramatic reduction since the prior census of 2010. And what we've seen is an influx of young professionals and young working families into the city. And that's where we get the increase in the population over the previous census. And what this has done is it's created many opportunities, but it's also created many challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that we face as a city is housing affordability at every level. You know, we talk a lot about affordable housing, low income housing, but housing has really become unaffordable at every level for working families, for young professionals, for anybody. We've seen home values double in recent years in the city of Providence, and even in neighborhoods like Elmwood and South Providence that are primarily populated with triple deckers that had median sale prices for many years between $200,000 and $300,000. We're seeing home sales in $500,000–$600,000 range. So if you really think about the median income of folks that live in these neighborhoods, when you start talking about a home selling for $500,000, the possibility for a family with a household income of $45,000–$50,000 ever being able to afford a $500,000 house just evaporates. And that's a real serious problem for many reasons, but primarily because homeownership is one of the few vehicles for building wealth in many of our families today. You know, my parents were able to buy a home early on many years ago, and it really changed the trajectory of our family. And I think that's a very common theme in a lot of families, the ability to build equity in property, the ability to have that sense of place, that sense of ownership in a neighborhood. It really has an impact not only on the family, on the children, but also on the community itself. So I know when I originally was approached to be a part of this series, my idea was to talk about neighborhood-based development. And I think that's the way we have to look to the future of Providence, because Providence is built out of 25 neighborhoods, including downtown, which we might not think of as a neighborhood. But I would argue that we should begin to think of it more and more as a neighborhood for opportunities. These neighborhoods vary in demographics, in economic output, in commercial activity, but what we all have is a history, a common history and a sense of place. A city with a rich history of innovation, both in industry and in the arts and culture, and a city of people who historically have taken risks. And I think that when we think of the future of the city of Providence, we have to think in terms of opportunity and risk. And this risk involves the way we approach public administration, it involves the way we approach public investments, and it involves the way we embrace new ideas that may not be immediately acceptable or comfortable to us. And one of the challenges that I found over the trajectory of my adult life as a community advocate and a public administrator is that we have a tendency to want to prepackage solutions. And then we want the target audience to adapt to the solution. And then we wonder why the solutions fail. We wonder why it's so hard for small businesses in our city to have access to capital. We wonder why it's so hard for employment to grow in our city. Well, I think that what we have to be looking at is really how do we adapt ourselves? How do we adapt our mentality? How do we invest in the opportunities that are organic, that exist currently? And I like to give an example. On the south side, there's a very dynamic small business community, very dynamic, primarily Latinos, primarily business people from the Dominican Republic, immigrants from the Dominican Republic. And if there's a common theme in that community, is that they're risk takers. And I can tell you many of the businesses that you see that thrive on the south side are businesses that were either opened with very little capital or were opened with unconventional capital, informal loans at ridiculous interest rates, you know, the type of scenario that many of us would scoff at and would run away from. And that tolerance for risk is informed by those entrepreneurs' life experience, you know, their experience as immigrants, their experiences back home. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. And not because it should encourage us to take unnecessary risks, but I think we need to really meet people where they are and where they're coming from. And I think the city has not done a good job of that. And I think that if we begin to look at neighborhood-based investment and identify the differences that exist in each of our neighborhoods and the opportunities that exist in each of our neighborhoods, we can not only have our neighborhoods flourish, we can increase the city's tax base, we can increase employment opportunities, and we can really do a lot to have our city grow into the future. And I specifically think about neighborhood business corridors like Smith Hill, Charles Street, Cranston Street, that are gateways from other cities and have been neglected or underdeveloped for many years. And there's remarkable opportunity. You know, I like to point out the Charles Street business corridor. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to drive along Charles Street in recent times, but Charles Street was a very vibrant mid-century commercial district. In the 50s and the 60s, it was incredibly vibrant. There were all types of shops, restaurants, businesses, car dealerships, repair shops. And it really entered into decline in the 1980s, and now it's very much a shell of its former self. There are very few storefronts, a lot of subsistence, like small bodegas and hair salons type businesses. And if you think about using Charles Street as an example, Charles Street runs into North Providence, which is a community that has a much higher median household income. And it's 2 miles away from Lincoln, which is a community that has a significantly higher median household income. So there is an opportunity not only to develop it as a focal point for commerce, but also to develop it in a way that can attract, you know, consumers from these neighboring communities and generate employment for the families that live in the North End. And I think there are a lot of different opportunities that exist that are similar to that, that we can take advantage of if we kind of adopt more of an open mind and get away from building programs and building prepackaged solutions. And I'm very confident that with the talent that we have in this city, with a lot of the thinkers that we have in this city, and a lot of particularly the younger generation of professionals and students that are here, that love this city, that have much more open minds than we do, and that have much greater ideas than we do, I think we can channel and leverage that talent and that energy to do remarkable things in our city. And that makes me very excited for the future. So I'm not going to speak much longer because I would love to hear from you and answer any of your questions and hear what ideas you have or what thoughts you have. So thank you. Yes, sir.
So you've done a great job of elucidating about all the types of issues we have and things that need to be worked on, and kind of how you might want to resolve some issues. I was wondering if you could just say, out of all the things I talked about, these are the 3 top issues that would form my agenda, I mean yours, what you would address and how you would specifically address each of those top 3, not going into, and you mentioned dozens of things.
Yes. So the top 3 issues that I think we need to address in this city is, first of all, the housing situation. The housing, we're having a we're in the middle of a housing crisis at every level, and it's not sustainable for us to continue to price people out of this market. And we're doing that at every level. And it's unfortunate because we lose a lot of talent as a result. The second thing that I think we need to focus on absolutely is our public education, our schools, the quality of our schools. You know, our schools have not been good for a long time. The difference is that because the economy, as I mentioned earlier, has evolved, in the past, folks had different options to earn living wages, to develop careers, to have different opportunities in life. Nowadays, we are very limited in the opportunities that we can provide to people who do not have a good academic or technical education beyond high school, beyond, you know, the basic 12 years. And the foundation for that is our public schools. And, you know, Rhode Island, a couple of years back, the state approved free tuition at CCRI for graduates of Rhode Island public schools. And what we find statistically is that a lot of our students from Providence who go to CCRI spend those 2 years in remedial classes, just getting up to college level on math, on reading comprehension. And so they're losing that opportunity to have that cost savings, because by the time they have gotten up to speed to be able to take college level courses, they already consumed the 2 years of free CCRI. And that's a problem. That's a significant failure. It's a policy failure. It's a political failure on our behalf. And I think we can address that. And I think the first thing we need to do is begin to plan for when the schools are returned to city control from the state takeover. And we need to have a citywide conversation, almost a statewide conversation on what it is we're actually going to do to address that. If you look at the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, they had a state takeover about a decade ago, and they went about it in a very different manner. They went about it by building consensus in the community initially, and once they had a strong base of support from parents, from the business community, from the local community, they were able to make significant strides and improve the quality of education in Lawrence. And Lawrence, the demographics are very similar to Providence. Even though it's a much smaller city, it's very similar. The difference that they had is that when they went through their takeover, they had significant support and buy-in from the state legislature. And in Massachusetts, public education is a right. It's a constitutional right. And so their funding formula is much more generous with public education than what we have here. So the solution isn't only what the city of Providence can do to change education policy and the politics of education. It's going to require the participation of state stakeholders as well. And that's been a challenge, because in the Rhode Island legislature, what we have is this recurring theme of leaders from outside of the city viewing the city as kind of a burden and as kind of a problem, and not a place that generates economic activity and opportunity and creativity and growth for the entire state, which it is. It's the state's engine. And the third piece, I would say, is quality of life issues, ranging from keeping our cities, our city streets safe and clean, to helping people or creating an environment where people are proud of their city, and they're proud of their community, they're proud of their neighborhoods. You know, we live in unfortunately a very cynical time for politics, and people tend to be very angry and very expressive, and social media is a fabulous conduct for that, for people to express their frustration and their disappointment. But we have a lot to celebrate in the city, and if we improve our services, if people can feel safe at every level, not only safe from crime, but safe from hunger, safe from being homeless, and people can feel that we're creating an environment for opportunity, for growth, for personal development, for professional development, I think we can do a lot to build up a sense of pride and a sense of place. And that will pay dividends, enormous dividends, because we need to be a place that people are drawn to, that people are excited about being here, and not a place where most conversations are about what's wrong, or about the schools being wrong, about the streets not being well kept, about the pension problem.
So that's great. We can go back to number one, housing. I would appreciate if you could elaborate more. So let me explain to you what I mean. What I hear you saying is there's a need for more affordable housing, but what I don't hear you talk about, are you talking about rental, cheaper rental housing? Are you talking about an increase in home ownership from construction of more inexpensive housing in certain areas? And what do you mean, what are you talking about in terms of percentages, what parts of the state, and how would you go about accomplishing that? I mean, I know maybe you have to post bonds and get the legislator to vote for it, but what are your positions on how you would accomplish, what is it more specifically what you want to accomplish, and how would you go about accomplishing it?
Well, I think there's opportunity at both for homeownership and for rentals. Currently, 50% of Providence's population are renters, right? But almost half of those are cost burdened, which means that they're paying, more than half of their take-home income towards their rental expense, and that is also unsustainable. But homeownership is critical, and I would focus primarily on homeownership. I think there are a lot of opportunities to facilitate homeownership, to leverage state and federal funding, to build new units, to rehab existing units, to take advantage of space. If you think of, I'll give you one example, the campus around the hospitals in South Providence. There are acres and acres and acres of parking lots that were that was an entire neighborhood that was leveled to make parking for the hospital campus. There is an opportunity to maybe we're not going to build blocks of triple deckers again, but we can leverage some of that land and reclaim it as a neighborhood. There's an opportunity. I was asked on the Boston Globe, at an interview for the Boston Globe, about the concept of getting something like Triggs. Triggs is a public golf course. It's a beautiful golf course. It's near my home, near Rhode Island College. It's more than 100 acres of publicly owned land. It's owned by the city of Providence, by you, the taxpayers. The city leases it to a private operator who runs the golf course. And the private operator pays the city $300,000 a year, right? And what I say is we should be looking at that as an opportunity to say, why can't we take that 100+ acres of land, set aside half of it for a public park, beautiful public access, free access park. The golf course is not free access. You have to pay to get on the golf course. It's fenced in. And the other half, we could turn into a neighborhood. We can turn into a neighborhood with single-family homes, two-family homes. There's a great opportunity. You could fit at least 200 or 300 homes on half of that land, and the other half would be a beautiful park with publicly accessible green space. And there are a lot of other opportunities like that. There are a lot of pockets of land in the city that are unused. The Public Redevelopment Agency owns dozens of lots that are irregular sized lots that they've been sitting on, and when you look at the city budget, they're in the ledger as assets, and they're just kind of sitting there, and they aren't really doing anything. And these are lots that can be developed for single-family homes, multi-family homes all over the city. There are opportunities with vacant buildings. There are opportunities with underutilized former industrial properties. There are many opportunities to develop both homeownership opportunities and rental opportunities.
If you exclude the students that are going to Brown and RISD and Roger, whatever, Johnson Wales or whatever's in the bounds of Providence, what percentage of renters in the city of Providence are Section 8?
I don't know what percentage that is, but I'm not exactly sure the percentage, but
isn't that supposed to be a federal means to allow people to be able to afford housing? I don't know, I'm just asking.
Yes, it's basically it functions almost as a voucher program for private homeowners. And that is, I think the challenge that we have in providing housing for our families is beyond that. I think the challenge that we have is for working families that have one or two parents that are working, that are around that median household income of $45,000 and are struggling to pay $24,000 a year in rent. You know, when you have a two-bedroom apartment in the West End that's on average between $1,800 and $2,200 a month, apartments that a few years ago were $900 a month, they were half. You know, so if we have a median income of $45,000, people are paying half of their income to live, in addition to what utilities and, you know, a lot of these apartments are in older homes where in the wintertime they're going to spend $250 on a month heating the home. So it's really cost prohibitive. So I think there's a lot of opportunities beyond the Section 8. Yes, sir, in the back.
I think the issue is much more complicated because many apartment owners would rather not rent to families with children, which is the dynamic that I think that many Providence politicians or advocates don't want to exactly deal with. But I'd like to ask you two questions. One, do you believe in rent controls?
I think there are different models of rent controls, and I think the rent control that seems to be the standard that a lot of folks look at is like what we see in cities like New York. And I'm not exactly sure if that works in a place like Providence. I think there should be some type of regulation of how much rents can go up over time, but I'm not sure if that very restrictive model, like what exists in New York, is something that would work here.
Because I think what makes Providence unique is that for many of these apartment owners, they don't live in Providence, they live in Boston.
Yeah.
Some even live in New York, which exacerbates the issue, which makes it totally, I agree with you, not the same as in terms of New York. And so that makes sense to me. Thank you very much.
But I think the answer to that is if we can grow, if we can have greater economic opportunity in our neighborhoods and help people achieve home ownership, they can buy these multifamily homes from these absentee landlords. Because I think when people own our first home was in Washington Park, and I can tell you on the street where we lived, almost all the homes were multifamily homes and they were owner occupied. And you could tell because people took great care and great pride in keeping the street clean and decorating the homes and making sure they were painted. And when you go to areas where there are all renters with very few owner occupants, the difference is dramatic. It's dramatic. And I think creating opportunities for more folks to own the homes they live in, it can have a significant impact, not only for the family, but for the sense of place, for the beauty of the neighborhood.
I couldn't agree with you more. And then lastly, my last question is, what would you do with Providence Place Mall? Because so many people now are going to that mall in Cranston, Rhode Island. They feel safer. Many of the businesses that were at Providence Place Mall are now in Cranston, Rhode Island. I won't say the name of the shopping center.
Talking about Garden City?
Oh, yeah, well, I didn't say it. Okay. As well as safety issues in the parking lot in Providence Place Mall. Or then lastly, the reluctance of even Eastsiders to go to Providence Place.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be your thoughts on Providence Place?
Well, I think there are two components to Providence Place Mall. One is the economic viability. Excuse me for a second. And I think in terms of economic viability, I think Providence Place Mall has been rather successful because it was first envisioned as an upscale mall, high-end shops where upper middle income folks would go to purchase things. And I think that the shopping trends have changed. And I think upper middle income folks have no interest in going to a mall. And the hassle of winding your way through 17 levels of parking and taking escalators and doing all these things is just not something that's attractive anymore. Whereas the shopping center that you reference is a place where you can park your car, 25 feet from the door of the nice boutique, and problem solved. And it's nice.
Parking is free.
It's free. It's tree lined. You breathe fresh air. It's very appealing in contrast to, this kind of gloomy adventure that you need to embark upon to get to a place in Providence Place. So in light of that, of the shifting trends in consumer behavior, I would say Providence Place Mall has actually been very successful. They've been able to evolve. They have a 90+% occupancy rate over time. That's remarkable. Malls all over the country have died and continue to die. So it's actually been quite successful. The problem that they have is the other problem, which is kind of like a sense of safety. Malls attract young people, and young people go there because it's a climate-controlled, large place to hang out, see, and be seen. And so I think there are opportunities for the mall management to have better control of that, and to work maybe collaboratively better with the city than, you have kind of these bursts of violence that happen, and then the Providence police has to be called in, and then they come in, commando style, and it seems to just, it just creates a bad look. It creates a bad look, and I think the mall administration, they have skirted their responsibility in keeping an eye and maybe, having better electronic surveillance, having an ambassador program. There are malls that don't necessarily have security cops in uniform, but they have folks that are walking around, very similar to what you see downtown with the downtown improvement district with the folks with the yellow outfits, that they give a sense of authority without threatening. And I think that Providence Place Mall could do a much better job of managing that situation without necessarily having to turn it into a police state.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Hi, Gonzalo. My name is Val,
Val.
and I am a low carbon emitter. And as I have started to live in Providence these 5 years, I'm starting to realize that I am part of a large constituency in Providence of low carbon emitting humans.
Mm-hmm.
People who don't drive cars anymore, in my case because of medical disability. I'm also a senior citizen, so I've got lots and lots of people in my age group who, like me, take the bus or we walk. But it seems in Providence that we're a very diverse group who are not driving in cars full time. And as I meet more people who are very young and they're students and they're walking or they're taking a bus or they're using a bike to get to school, high schools like where you student taught, or to university, and I'm meeting people who are working and using public transportation, using bicycles, getting to work on foot. I'm realizing that I'm not part of a tiny group. And when I first moved to Providence and I became a low carbon emitter, I thought I was part of a very slender group. I spent most of my life in a two tons of metal hurtling down the highway. But we're a rather large group. We're rather socioeconomically diverse.
Mm-hmm.
We're rather ethnically diverse group. And it seems like we're growing. It seems like we're getting more bike lanes. It seems like a lot is happening in Providence because housing shortages mean we can't have two cars because you can only park one car on the street or you're renting or whatever. It seems like we're not getting smaller. This cohort's growing. When you're mayor, what does this all mean to you, this cohort of low carbon emitting humans? And what does it mean for the future of Providence?
That's fantastic. I have been very excited about the city's continued interest in multimodal transportation. And I think it's unfortunate that the city has really no say in the RIPTA system, because I think that there's a lost opportunity there to have kind of a network of maybe smaller, more energy efficient buses servicing the city beyond the traditional RIPTA routes that just kind of cut through the city on their way into the suburbs. I love bikes. I own several bikes. I own a 1974 road bike, which is my vintage, and I'm very excited about that. But I agree that the number of folks that care about this and that have really moved away from using traditional vehicles, private automobiles, as their primary source of transportation is something important. It's going to continue to grow. And I've watched with a little bit of amusement the mixed reactions that the current administration has received when they begin to implement some of their bike lanes in different parts of the city. And not far from here, a few blocks from here on South Water Street, there was practically a civil war over the implementation of a three-block stretch. And guess what? After all that drama, all the news coverage, it's working perfectly fine. I had lunch at Plant City yesterday. There was parking on both sides. There were people clearing off the bike lane, and cars are forced to slow down because the road is narrow. It serves the purpose. It's fantastic. Nobody got hurt. Everything works. I think we need to build on that. I think there is an opportunity for that, and I think we have been reliant on cars for so long that they've become almost second nature. And if you look at a map of downtown and you look at the amount of space that is dedicated to surface parking, it's really absurd. It's really absurd. And you wonder, at more than a century ago, our population was much higher than it is now. And part of the way we were able to do that is they didn't have acres and acres of surface parking. Those were all buildings with apartments and units in them. And I think that as we look at cities across the world and across the United States that are really embracing multimodal transportation, embracing this kind of shift in behavior, we need to look at that, because that will also accelerate our ability to use all this surplus land and spaces to build housing, which I think is a much better use of land than parking 20 cars. You can fit 20 cars in the space that you can put a 30 apartment building or a 40 apartment building. And if you think about how wasteful that is to have these huge stretches of pavement, it's just unacceptable. So I'm very excited about the future of that. And I'm also excited that, as you said, that cohort of folks that care about this significantly continues to grow and grow and grow. So it's not an outlier. It's not a trend. It is what it is. And it's something that we've actually are behind in this, and we're trying to catch up. And I'm very excited about that.
I wonder if you could, you briefly mentioned pension funds.
Yes.
And that sounds like such an intractable problem, and I wonder what your approach would be if you were elected mayor.
So you're all aware that we have a significant unfunded pension liability. And that sounds scary, because it is scary. And it's not scary because all that money is going to be due at once. It's scary because the payment that we have to make year after year to sustain the pension system is outgrowing the city's economic growth. So if we have the city's economy and the tax base grows at 2% a year, and our pension payment, our annual required contribution grows at 5%, more than twice the rate. So what it begins to do is, over time, it begins to crowd out our ability to spend on services, on basic fundamental things. And that doesn't mean that the city is going to go into bankruptcy tomorrow. What it means is that with every year that goes by, we can dedicate less money to the services that you as taxpayers expect, because we have to send more money to cover the pension gap. There have been different attempts to address that, and the change has been incremental, and it's been helpful, but the rate of growth of our city's pension contributions will become unsustainable over time in the next decade or so. So the current administration now is requesting all authorization to float a pension obligation bond, which is normally something that public finance experts frown upon because it incurs significant risk. It's basically, you borrow money at 4%, you invest it in the stock market, and you have an expected rate of return of 7%, and the spread between the cost of borrowing the money and what it generates will technically or theoretically or hopefully pay for the costs of borrowing the money. Under the right circumstances, that can work very well. But there are also there's also the risk and the opportunity that the stock market can go down, and then you end up having to cover not only the original unfunded liability, but now the debt service on these bonds. So I'm excited that there are a lot of people talking about this now, and there are a lot of thought leaders and people paying attention to it, because I think that the way the system is set up, the mayor's proposal to float pension obligation bonds requires multiple vetting processes. It needs to be approved by the legislature, and then it would need to be approved by the city council, and then it would need to be voted on by the people of Providence. And I think that multi-layer approach of public vetting and public scrutiny is fantastic, because it gives all of us the opportunity to ask the difficult questions. Because the devil is always in the details. There are a lot of moving parts to this type of program that can either increase or mitigate risk significantly. And bonding $500 million is not insignificant. So I think I have an open mind towards that approach. I think if that were not to pass, then we need to really focus on a more traditional approach, which would be to try to grow our tax base more by incentivizing more development, by growing the economy, by curtailing costs, and by very careful stewardship of the city budget. There are no simple solutions. The problem that has been baking for more than 3 decades due to political decisions that were made in the past for expediency. The prior administrations, not just in Providence, all over the place. For example, New Haven, where Yale is. New Haven is the size of Warwick, and they have a $950 million unfunded pension liability. So it's not something that is unique to us, but the challenge that we have is that the Rhode Island the Providence pension fund is one of the lowest funded in the country. We're at 22% right now, and so what the mayor is proposing is a massive infusion of cash to bring it up to about 50 or 60% funded, and then let the stock market grow it from there, which is always risky.
Okay, last question.
Yes, sir.
No, go ahead.
No, I wanted to invite you all over, but if you have a question, quickly, and then we'll do that.
Yeah. I think one of I've been in Providence now from the Buddy era.
Yes.
And basically it seems to me we need to get more public involvement in no matter what we're trying to solve. Mm-hmm. I'm sure if we concentrated on all the problems of what happens on the roads, and we would end up with a good public transport system, as long as you've got everyone participating. For instance, with the pension thing, it seems to me, Buddy just said, hey, I have a pension. I got a can, I'm kicking it down the road. The next guy's going to have to look after it. Mm-hmm. So how do you, as an individual or as a mayor, convince through your personality or whatever to get everyone on board and to get everyone involved in everything?
Yes. So that's a big challenge. Civic engagement is a big challenge. When I was in the Secretary of State's office, we worked a lot on increasing civic engagement around issues. And there are multiple parts to that. The first part is you have to make the issue relevant to people's lives, because folks are busy living, and usually people that are better, that are more well off, have more bandwidth to think about things that are more abstract. And people that are in survival mode are thinking about paying their rent. And so what we have to do is we have to make things relevant to people's lives. We have to make a connection between an issue that's happening and how that impacts lives. Government is terrible at that. It's terrible. It's terrible at communicating that relevancy. The other thing we need to do is we need to invest in economic opportunities so more people are doing better, so they have more bandwidth to focus on these things, as opposed to having 3 side hustles, which is what many of people in Providence have. And I think another thing we need to do is we need to better utilize the soft power of government. You have the administrative powers that the city charter and the state constitution and the United States Constitution gives elected officials. And then you have the soft power, which is the power to persuade, to get people excited about things, to build coalitions with other elected officials, with community leaders, with neighborhood leaders. And I think that we, because of the way our society is, because of these endless news cycles, because of the pervasive nature of social media, we talk in bullet points, and we're jumping from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing, and we're not really taking care to get people excited about issues, to get people involved in issues, to get meaningful involvement in things, and I think that's a lost opportunity, and I think we can take advantage of that. I would certainly plan on doing that when I'm mayor, so I don't know.
Before I thank our speaker, I wanted to say 2 things. Thank Paul, who is our videographer over there.
Thank you, Paul.
I wanted to thank Bridges, who is next door and agreed to at the door. And I wanted to say Brown asked us not to serve food for the first 2 weeks, so that people are encouraged to keep their masks on, but at least we have a glass of wine for you and some water. And I hope we can continue the conversation a little bit longer next door. But I wanted to thank Gonzalo. This was really fantastically interesting, and I wish you all the best. And thank you for all this information and really thoughtful comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.